Welcome back to the Ejaries.a podcast. This is the 10th and final episode. I'm Stephen. We've covered what Ejaries are, the registration process, documents, renewal, rejection, DEWA, visas, commercial differences, and what to do when a landlord refuses to register. This last episode closes the cycle. What happens when a tenancy ends and how Ejaries are cancelled. The end of tenancy timeline. The end of a residential tenancy in Dubai typically precedes a longer timeline that begins 30 to 90 days before the contract end date. If the tenant intends to renew, they let the landlord know within the notice period, agreement is reached on terms, and the contract is renewed. We covered this in episode 4 on renewal. If the tenant intends to vacate, they give notice per the contract, typically 30 to 90 days. The landlord acknowledges, plans are made for handover. If the landlord wants to end the tenancy and reclaim the property, they serve the required 12-month notarized legal notice on defined grounds. The tenant responds. The tenancy continues until the notice period expires. In each case, the Ejaries record continues to reflect the current tenancy until the formal closure happens at handover. The handover. The handover itself is the moment when the tenant returns the property to the landlord. Keys, access cards, parking remotes, any other items provided with the property. Before handover, the tenant typically gets the property cleaned, repairs any damage they're responsible for, and ensures the property is in the condition required by the contract. The landlord or their representative inspects the property. They confirm the condition and identify any issues that affect the deposit return. This is also when the tenant clears outstanding service charges to the building, settles any utility bills that aren't already settled through DEWA, and obtains the move-out clearance letter from the building or property management. The move-out clearance letter is important. It confirms the tenant has settled their obligations to the building and is leaving with no outstanding issues. Several downstream procedures require this letter. Closing the DEWA account. DEWA closure happens around the handover date. The tenant requests final meter readings through the DEWA Smart app or by visiting a service center. DEWA reads the final meters, calculates the final bill, settles against the deposit held when an account was opened, and refunds any balance. This typically takes between a few days and 2 weeks to complete. The refund is made to the tenant's bank account. The DEWA closure should happen on or close to the handover date. Closing too early leaves the property without utilities during the tenant's last days there. Closing too late means the tenant continues to receive bills for a property they've vacated. Closing the Ejaries record. The Ejaries record is closed once the tenancy has formally ended. The closure happens through the Dubai REST app or through an Ejari typing center. It confirms that the tenancy is over, the property has been returned, and the Ejaries registration no longer reflects an active tenancy. The required documents typically include the move-out clearance letter, the final DEWA settlement, and confirmation that any outstanding rent or other obligations have been settled. The closure registers the end date of the tenancy on the central record. The Ejari certificate becomes a historical document. The property record is freed for the next tenant. Why closure matters. Some tenants ask whether closing the Ejaries record actually matters. The tenancy has ended. The tenant has moved out. What difference does the closure make? It matters for several reasons. The next tenant's Ejaries registration depends on the property being available on the register. If the previous tenant's Ejaries are still showing as active, the new registration can flag or be paused while the system reconciles. The previous tenant's residency record continues to show them at the address. This can cause complications for the tenant's next address registration and for any procedures they undertake at their new home. For the landlord, the property record shows continuously occupied. The landlord may not be able to register a new tenant cleanly. Closure isn't just a formality. It's the act that releases the property and frees the parties for what comes next. Deposit refund. The security deposit at the start of the tenancy is held by the landlord. At the end of the tenancy, it's refunded to the tenant, lest any deductions for unpaid amounts, damage beyond normal wear, or other agreed costs. The deposit refund isn't part of the Ejaries system per se. It's between the landlord and tenant under the terms of the contract, but it's connected to the end of tenancy process and often happens in parallel with the Ejaries closure. If the landlord refuses to return the deposit or makes deductions the tenant disputes, the matter can go to the rental dispute settlement center. But the center requires the Ejaries record as part of the case. This is why having clean Ejaries throughout the tenancy matters even at the end. The center's ability to hear a deposit dispute depends on the registration history. Moving to a new property. Most tenants who close one tenancy in Dubai are moving to another. The end of one Ejari cycle is the beginning of the next. The sequence at the new property mirrors the start sequence we covered in episode 2. Sign the contract, register Ejaries, open. DEWA, update immigration records if needed. There's a brief overlap period the tenant has typically signed at the new property before they've handed over the old one. During this window, the old Ejaries are still active, the new Ejaries are being registered, and the tenant has 2 records on the system temporarily. The system handles this without issue, as long as the old record closes shortly after. For tenants who are leaving Dubai entirely, rather than moving to another property, the picture is different. The Ejaries record closes, the DEWA account closes, the residency visa is cancelled separately, the tenant departs. In this case, the cleanliness of the closure becomes particularly important because there's no follow-up address to anchor any loose ends. The tenant should obtain final confirmation that all records are closed before leaving, so that nothing remains in their name in Dubai after departure. End of tenancy disputes. Not every tenancy ends amicably. Sometimes there are disputes at the end about the condition of the property, the deposit, alleged unpaid amounts, or other matters. Where disputes arise, the Rental Dispute Settlement Centre is again the recourse. The centre hears cases on deposit disputes, end of tenancy disagreements, and similar matters. For the centre to hear the case, the tenancy needs to have been on the Ejaries register. The whole sequence of registrations across the tenancy provides the evidentiary record the centre relies on. This is the moment, more than any other, where the patience is keeping Ejaries current throughout the tenancy pays off. The tenant, who registered Ejaries annually, kept the certificates, settled the rent. Calculate a question at each renewal, has a clean documentary record to bring to the centre. The tenant who didn't has a weaker case. What to take from this episode? The end of a tenancy involves a sequence of closing procedure that mirror the opening ones. Handover, DEWA closure, Ejaries closure, deposit return. The move-out clearance letter from the building is required for several of these procedures. Obtain it at handover. Closing the Ejaries record matters, even if it feels like a formality. It frees the property for the next tenant and removes the tenant's name from the address record. The deposit refund is handled between landlord and tenant under the contract. Disputes go to the Rental Dispute Settlement Centre. The centre's ability to hear the case depends on the tenancy having been on the Ejaries register. For tenants leaving Dubai entirely, obtain final closures before departure. Loose ends are harder to resolve from outside the country. Closing the series. This is the last episode of this series. We've covered 10 dimensions of how Ejaries work in Dubai, what they are, how they get registered, the documents, renewal, rejection, DEWA, visas, commercial, differences, landlord refusal, end of tenancy. The picture I hope you take away is that Ejaries are not just an administrative requirement. Tenants who treat them as an afterthought eventually find out that hard way that the system was building the picture all along and they weren't part of it. If you take one thing from this series, take this. Get the Ejaries registered. Keep them current. Close them cleanly. The rest follows. From that, tenants who treat them as an afterthought eventually find out that hard way that the system was building the picture all along, and they weren't part of it. If you take one thing from this series, take this. Get the Ejaries registered. Keep them current. Close them cleanly. The rest follows. From that, thanks for listening. The full transcript of every episode in this series is at transcript.a. For Ejaries registration support, ejarish.a is the operational service.